I need it too.
All right, that's your cue, everybody. If you want to go anonymous, now's the time. Thanks,
Uh,
Aidan.
Thank you for the introduction. And I always just blanch a little bit at, oh, he's amazing and whatever, because it reminds me of my wife. She tells everybody what great popcorn I make. Oh, he makes the best popcorn on planet Earth. And then the pressure's on. It's for sure recipe for burning it or having too many kernels unpopped or whatever. But anyhow, thanks too for saying, hey, shake off the day, because I need to do that too. I'm happy to shake off the rest of my day just to step in here and have time with you all. Um, I've been looking forward to this for some time, and this as virtual's good. It can be really good. In person is amazing. So I'm sad I'm not there with everybody in person. But that said, this type of format and is one of my favorites where we can have a community conversation. So on that note, uh, I welcome input, questions, comments, whatever you want to do along the way. This is a two-parter. So we have, I can't remember, Kelsey might help with the date of the second one,
Yes,
but
you. I can
we're,
hop in there later.
yeah,
Yeah.
thank you. Um, so there might be some overlap, a little bit of content next time, but it will be different enough that it shouldn't bother anybody. Some of what I'll talk about today will be certainly either set aside for the next time or shortened, abbreviated in some way. Um, so let's see. Uh, Also know that we can be as organic as we want in this conversation. So know that I'm flexible in that way. And that said, I will start with a bit of a PowerPoint presentation for you all. But before I do, I want to just give a little bit more background on my work. It's been almost 20 years of stepping into schools to talk about transgender kids. I don't think non-binary was a term anybody was using yet, but gender diverse kids in schools. And I very much will always remember the very first school I went to. It was a school in Oakland, California, and they had a transgender student. They had a third grader, transgender boy, and it was just the learning terrain and that engagement alone by stepping in with the educators, by stepping in with the parent community, and with all the students, K through, I think the school is a K through 8 school, is still very relevant in terms of what I encounter today, almost 20 years later. And I will say that even though I had done work on gender inclusion in workplace situations, thinking about what do kids need? How do we do this in classrooms? What are the concerns of parents, and how do we take what has largely been in the a conversation that's been in the realm of adults, and how do we bring it in? And you know, I'll admit I didn't know. And the beautiful part of this work, which is still a huge part of the work, my work world today, is the collaborative effort. I know a little bit about gender, and I can answer some of the questions that some people would have. And they knew a lot about their kids. So that combination coming together uh, was pretty fantastic. So yeah, let me see. Do I want to say anything else about that? I don't know. Good enough for now. I've been in hundreds of schools at this point and all over the US. Still have some states to hit if I'm checking them off the checklist, which I hope to do. But I will also say that while each school community says, "Well, gosh, Aiden, our school community or our district is probably different than what you're used to." Um, every single one of those school communities are different, but they don't know how much they have in common with each other. And that is independent of the political landscape, whether it's urban or rural, whether it's a culturally diverse population or one that's more homogenous, you name it. Um, the questions are pretty consistent. And what I love about that is that the one thing they have in common is that these are teachers and parents who love their kids. They love the students and they want to do right by them. So that's a pretty solid foundation from which I've been able to do this work. All right. I would like to start off by just sharing a video with you. It's a little animated video from a national, actually, it has international reach um, podcast called How to Be a Girl. So let me pull that up and we will we'll just start with that.
When my 3-year-old son told me that he was actually a girl, I had no idea what to make of it. But then I thought, okay, so he likes pink and pretty things. No problem. I can go with this. I figured the girl thing must be a phase, but I was worried. And my child seemed so sad. So I went to a psychologist. She said that I was right. It probably was a phase. She told me that 80% of kids like mine didn't end up being transgender. 80%? That's a lot. I told my family and friends not to worry. But what about the other 20%? I was scared of that part. I didn't know anything about it. What was this transgender thing? I think I saw something about it once on Jerry Springer. That certainly didn't seem like a healthy option for my sweet child. I went to a conference about gender, and a doctor who works with transgender kids said something really interesting. She said that 80% number was bunk. She said that statistic came in part from a study at a clinic for transgender kids in the Netherlands. Apparently, when the kids stopped going to the clinic assumed they weren't transgender anymore. But nobody checked up on them to make sure this was true. Maybe they'd found another doctor. Maybe their parents weren't okay with them being transgender. Maybe they'd moved. But we don't know because nobody checked. There have been some other studies in the United States. These studies happened in the 1950s up through the 1970s. They studied lots of boys who were considered too feminine for the time. The studies found that most of these boys grew up to be gay men, and only a few of them ended up being transgender. But they didn't distinguish between effeminate little boys and boys who actually said they were girls. What about those kids? What about the ones like mine who insist they are another gender? Today, there's a gender clinic in Toronto that works with transgender kids. Their goal has been to prevent kids from turning out to be transgender. This clinic claims that 80% of their patients get cured, and they have a long history of telling parents that kids like mine shouldn't be allowed to play with girl stuff. Apparently, a lot of the problem is the mothers. So the moms get lots of therapy too. I tried a little bit of this method with my own kid. Her last Christmas as a boy was horrible. After that, I stopped fighting my kid. I finally let her start living as the girl she'd been saying she was. In 2013, a new study began at the University of Washington in Seattle. They're interviewing kids like mine, starting at age 3, and they're planning to interview them every year as they grow up to get some real research on these kids. Unlike the older studies, all the kids in this study say they are a different gender. Will they still say this when they're older? Or is it true that 80% of them will change their minds? We're just going to have to wait and see. So, what about my child? Well, I actually already have a statistic for her. She's 100% amazing.
Okay. Um, I love that little animation because it's really got a lot packed in there. And it addresses some of the things that I want to chat about today. But I do want to take a little second to talk about a historical shift here. It's not as if transgender people are all of a sudden showing up, whereas they didn't exist before. But the notion was that we can address this gender difference, this gender phase or confusion, or however it's been framed. We can send those who really persist in that notion, we can send them to get professional help. And through any type of activities like behavior modification or other things, we can get their gender identity to line up with their biological sex. Um, we have information that is helpful to us today to understand that that is actually not effective and it's actually a very harmful practice. So what we did in the past was teach kids to deny or hide some of this natural expression of themselves. Does it mean that some kids aren't going through phases? No, of course not. A lot of kids go through exploratory phases. But those who were really insistent were often, I don't even know. I can't say that they all went for professional help, but nevertheless, that was the message before. Let's change that gender identification with that kid and then they can move forward in life. And I don't want to say this was meant to harm people. This was actually meant to optimize their life and their experience. Because, if you don't line up with the gender norms and expectations, you get attention. And oftentimes that is very negative attention. Um, so with studies that have occurred over the last couple of decades, we're getting new information. And one of those studies surveyed, let's see, it's been a while, maybe 2012 or so, about 6,500 trans people, self-identified in whatever way. And they surveyed them about their lives and their experiences. And the results that they got back were just so painful that they named the study injustice at every turn because of regardless of whatever risk factor, whether that was homelessness or drug and alcohol abuse or suicide attempts or whatnot, the stats were so high, well above the national average. So if the national average for making an attempt on one's own life is in the single digits, for this population, it was 41%. Another study was done maybe a tad earlier, but ballpark in the same time frame. The Family Acceptance Project, and the Family Acceptance Project came up with similar numbers. What they saw compared with this injustice at every turn, but they also asked an additional question of the participants, and that question was, have you, in your upbringing, in your childhood, did you have the support of one adult? Did you have the support of someone who said, "Hey, I think you're amazing. You're perfect the way you are"? And if that person answered in the affirmative, and you popped out those people, then their numbers were much closer to the national average. So that, sparked a pretty significant societal aha moment, which said, gosh, maybe the efforts to um, change or shift one's gender identity aren't so successful. And if we don't make efforts to change that, well, what do we do? Well, if we want to be supportive, because that seems to have a direct correlation to much more positive outcomes, uh, to support them means essentially changing the world instead. Pretty tall order. And we are definitely in that effort as we speak. So I think that the medical and mental health professions are understanding this. The medical societies, the associations, like the American Academy of Pediatrics and the World Health Organization and any number of other organizations are putting out statements in support of gender affirming care, supporting a young person's gender identification. Um, and we're busy figuring out what does that look like, and we're busy figuring out what does that look like in schools. Um, the in my work world, let me think about this. 2000, late 2007, I started my first support group for parents of transgender and non-binary children. Uh, and there was just a handful of folks there. Those groups have grown significantly. And as those parents come, they're almost 100% in some significant distress. There's not been a family that said, wow, I'm so excited that I have a transgender kid. It is often a pretty turbulent journey for them. But they understand, they begin to understand how supporting their child's exploration, and especially independent of the outcome, can at least, at the very least in the moment, be helpful to their children, can optimize their experience. And whether they are moving through a phase or not, if it's a phase, fantastic. If it's not a phase, fantastic. But nevertheless, what the child experiences is that love and support and acceptance from that adult in their lives. So they start to get to that place. And as soon as they get there, they say, oh, but wait a minute. That's fine if I can keep my kid home. But I have to send my kid out the door into the neighborhood to play at school or other activities or things that they're engaging with. They have to talk to immediate family members, extended family members, and so on. It starts to become a pretty hefty lift pretty immediately. So that is the difference from back then. Hey, let's just focus on the child, see if we can change that gender identification or just squeeze it out of them. And then everyone else is fine. And maybe the kid is not. Or we turn to society and say, well, do we want to do this? Do we want to take a look and consider what we might do to be more inclusive, to have a little more room to scoop up people? So I happen to think that it can feel like a really big ask, but in actuality, in practice, it's not so big. The journey to get there is often fraught with high emotions, and that has not changed in recent times. I think it's probably ramped up a bit, but nevertheless, from where I sit, with almost 20 years of working with schools on gender inclusion, the pathway is not difficult. So that's part of what we'll chat about today. Let me I did want to mention too that in that little animated short there, they talked about the Toronto clinic. I believe that clinic has been closed for quite some time now. They had an independent review to see about their practices and decided that they were not in the best interests of children. So that clinic has closed. Um, and we understand better today that those practices are more in the context of reparative therapy or conversion therapy, which is now outlawed in almost half the states of the US, recognizing that that can be very harmful, not just with respect to gender identity. Um, One other study I want to mention is the Trans Youth Project that was mentioned in that animation as well. That began in 2013. We're over halfway into this 20-year longitudinal study at this point. What I loved about about this study, is that principal researcher understood that delineating between gender and sexuality and how one expresses their gender versus a stated gender identity are all things that need to be taken into consideration, and is doing that with this study. So a couple of things immediately with being halfway through this study is they're putting out publications about their findings all along the way. There's a lot to say about it, but I want to just mention a couple of things. One is that when the measures they use to test children's relationship to gender identity, their gender cognition, they found that the transgender children had just as strong of a cognition and recognition of their gender identity as the control subjects who were not transgender. So there was an effort of understanding gained by using explicit and implicit measures, meaning they don't have time to think about it. They don't have time to think about what the researcher is asking or wanting. They're more implicit measures. And so that was a pretty powerful outcome that came pretty early. And I got to say, no surprise to me, they validated what has come about from the Family Acceptance Project, that, hey, what's the number one factor for successful outcomes in the well-being of these kids? It's the support of a parent or caregiver. So yeah, there's just a lot more to say about that, but I'm going to leave it there. Okay, so I'd like to get back to share with you a couple of things. When I I think I know, like at the beginning, I thought, well, shoot, people want to learn about transgender kids. Well, so what can I share with them? I'll look up some statistics, and I'll give some people some handouts, and I found that was not what people needed. I did discover some things along the way that are pretty straightforward, but kind of only after the fact. So I want to take a moment and talk about that. So give me a second to get back to the PowerPoint here. Oh, I found that it could be helpful to actually pause for a moment and say, well, what the heck is gender? What do we mean when we say the word gender? I know I have a very clear memory as a young person of seeing the word gender as well as the term sex and being synonymous with each other. And both of those meaning, are you a boy or are you a girl? And that sex was also used to describe an activity. And I thought, well, why would they have the same word to describe these different things? That was a little confusing to me. But I remember that from the youngest age possible, and nobody else was asking those questions that I knew of. So why don't we take a second and talk about that? If I'm stepping in a room of adults and I say, hey, how do we know if somebody is a man or a woman? Adults go here. We talk about bodies. We talk about the fact that men have XY chromosomes and women have XX. And we talk about genital configuration. Men have penises, women have vulvas. And there you go. We have this clear, completely agreed upon understanding of gender, and that it has to do with our bodies. I didn't learn about variations on this until I was well into adulthood and doing my own poking around and research on this subject. So many of you have likely heard the term intersex before. There are a number of physiological differences that are encapsulated by this term intersex. The acronym there, the DSD, that's more of a medical term to describe the same thing, differences of sex development. Okay, so what is that? Well, these are differences in the way that our genitals develop. These are differences in our chromosomal makeup. It is not just XX and XY. There are quite a number of variations of chromosomal makeup that include XYY or an XXY or a single X or a triple X or an XO, or sometimes people have XX and XY chromosomes in different parts of their body. There are, to the best of my knowledge, I'm not a huge expert on this, so there are people who are, but I do have a little bit of understanding in that there are over 30 differences that are identified. That the frequency of each of these varies. Some are pretty rare, some are more common. But if you pool them all together, you're talking about roughly 1 in 300 people. I've used that number for a while. I found that on the Intersex Society of North America's website. Some people have said that number's too high, Aidan. It's more like 1 in 1,000. Somebody else said, no, that's not even close. It's more like 1 in 50 people. It's hard to say because some of these intersex differences are not going to be noticeable by the person experiencing them. So they may not even know that they have a difference that could fall into that category. Some people may not know until later in life. Uh, some are more pronounced, and I think even a few require some medical intervention. But the reality is 1 in 300 is a reasonable number to grab, and that is a lot of people. So if you have stepped out into the world and met a set of identical twins, the frequency of identical twin births is roughly 1 in 1,000. So you're just that much more likely to meet somebody with an intersex difference. Again, you may not know that about them, but I do know that that frequency occurs enough that a lot of uh, high school biology classes stopped the practice of testing chromosomes as part of their curriculum because people got some serious surprises in their classrooms. So I think it's important to bring this into this conversation because we can't say men have XY chromosomes, women have XX. I have met a number of women who have XY chromosomes. You would not know by looking at them that that is a factor. And yet, if you looked at some cells under a microscope, you would see that. Um, so, okay, we as adults are talking about this, and guess what? We are largely accurate when we use these markers. And we need to recognize that we're leaving out a lot of people and that it is time to bring the reality of our human anatomical experience into the equation. There's uh, a documentary called Intersection on Canopy if you're ever interested in learning a little bit more about that. So that's there. So guess what? If I'm chatting with kids in a classroom and I say, "How do you know if somebody is a boy or a girl?" Here's where they go. Well, girls have long hair, boys have short hair. Um, Okay, and as soon as a kid says that, somebody else says, "Well, my aunt has really short hair and she's a girl." Oh, well, girls paint their fingernails, boys don't. Except the kid next to the other one says, "My cousin paints his fingernails, he's a boy." I've heard people, those sweet stories from these kids' mouths are amazing. What's the one? A kid said, "Boys like to blow up things, girls don't." Okay. I'm having a moment there, like, how do I even respond to that? Except I didn't need to. A little gal raises her hand and says, "I like to blow up things and I'm a girl." And one kid said, "Men have gray hair and women don't." Now, I'm thinking about my mom right in that moment because she's like, "Oh, you need to talk to those kids. I don't care how old they are. You need to tell them how society treats women compared to men. And men are can age a little more naturally while women are expected to look 25 their entire life." And I'm thinking, "But mom, they're 7." But while all this is going on in my head, another kid raises his hand and says, "No, women have gray hair too. It's all just right here," and points to the part line in the hair. Um, the reality is these conversations are amazing and brilliant, and those kids don't need an adult to support them in the conversation. They all can challenge the various things that any of them say about um, what makes a boy, what makes a girl. So they're bringing up activities, sports or toys, colors, and things like that. And at the same time, they're easily challenging themselves and um, each other on whether or not colors are just colors or toys are just toys. And hair is just the hair on your head, whether it's long or short. That is a real crucial piece to how to bring in the conversation of gender with children of any age. I've had the conversation with kids as young as preschool on up. Um, Anything else I want to say about this? The third factor to bring into the conversation has to do with gender identity. Gender identity, very simply defined, is a person's internal sense of their own gender. So if you go, "Hey, Aidan, what's your gender?" and Aidan answers back, then I have my gender identity. Most people don't need this term. Most people have a sense of their gender that matches their anatomical sex. And there you go. Why would you even need an additional term? But the problem is that there's an assumption that that is true for everyone. And that is not the case. So being able to uh, pull this concept in is important. It's not a new concept, except that it's newer for average Josephina person in society to think about this term. And this is the key to understanding the experience of a transgender or non-binary or otherwise gender diverse person. Um, the sense of gender identity is different than what one might expect based on what we decide about them and based on their anatomical sex. So I would like to show you a short video. This is from a documentary produced by National Geographic. It's hosted by Katie Couric. And it's just a clip of speaking to a couple of physicians.
We know that scientists believe that something happens to the trans brain while it's developing in utero. But there's also some evidence from human brains examined post-mortem that seems to show trans brains are in fact different. And ground zero is the hypothalamus, the tiny nerve center that controls your heart rate, sleep, and metabolism. Scientists initially believed that the hypothalamus of a gay man would resemble that of a woman. But what they found surprised them.
Down below, we have the staining pattern of a gay man. The picture above is the staining pattern of a straight man. And observe, there is no difference between the gay man and the straight man. However, over here in this corner, we have the staining pattern for a transgender woman. And observe that even though her external body parts at birth may have been male, she has the same staining pattern as the non-transgender, as the cisgender woman. What it tells us is that there are areas in the brain that correlate with gender identity and not with external body parts.
But it's not just hormones, like testosterone, influencing how our brains are wired. It may also be in our genes. Why do scientists think that? A 2012 study out of Belgium found that among fraternal twins who do not share identical DNA, the likelihood that if one twin is trans, the other will be is very low. But among identical twins, the likelihood shoots up to 40%. What does that mean?
Well, what that says to me is that your DNA is playing a role here because the identical twins essentially share the same DNA, whereas the non-identical twins don't.
We don't know if this is one gene or 8 genes or a group of genes that are affected in slightly different ways, but I absolutely do believe that we will have a day when you can do either a brain scan or a blood test, and we will be able to say that, yes, your kid has the biology in their brain for the opposite gender identity.
I'll come back to that in a second, but I wanted to pause it there and share with you this this thing that always shows up when I watch that, which is the trans brain. Let's just say that there's not such a thing as a trans brain. We have brains in our head, and we have human brains, and the variations that show up with respect to our neurobiology are vast, as are the differences in our bodies, whether that's our height, our weight, our skin color, or any other number of factors. So I always get a little amused when they say the trans brain. And I wanted to point that out because I think there can be a little challenging issue that shows up if we decide there's a male brain, a female brain, and a trans brain. So I'm gonna discourage you all from going there. What even the one physician talking about looking at the cells, the brain cells, and doing a staining pattern to see areas of the brain that correlate with gender. You see, or they mention that the brain of a trans woman looks like that of other women. Okay, that's fine, except that there's a wide variation. There's a spectrum of gender differences, or I don't even know if I would call them gender differences, but that seem to correlate with gender that are not just this and that. Can we get to a place of stepping outside of an either or, a black and white, a male or female construction of gender? Well, holy moly, we're busy trying to figure out the answer to that question right now. It doesn't seem so hard to me because I live and breathe it. It's the first thing that kind of made sense to me in terms of being a trans person and having a sense of gender from a very early age that didn't seem to match up with what other people saw. I didn't have language to describe it. I didn't have people to look to that with shared experience. And I'm an identical twin. So my twin sister didn't seem to have the same relationship to gender that I did. All I knew is that the way she did her gender was viewed as acceptable, and the way I did mine was not. So a journey of puzzling things out. But I can say that both my sister and I understood our differences from a very early age, and society taught us later that that one way of being was viewed as right, and the other way of being was viewed as wrong. So let's see. Let me get back to my slides here. I'll tell you more about this book in a minute. Let me tell you about this book right now. This is a kid's book. I love it. I think it's an all ages book personally. This is a great vehicle to talk about gender identity with kids. It's about a crayon, and we see that the crayon's name is red. We see, however, that the crayon is doing something very different than what a red crayon might normally do. So there's a lot of discussion from all the other crayons about this, and it's the journey that red goes through in this story that is so amazing. What I love about it is that this is a way to talk about one's internal sense of gender, one's gender identity, and that we don't always know someone's gender based on what we perceive on the outside. And my instruction or suggestions, I should say, to teachers is to use this to talk about gender, but also what about any aspect of our identity, about who we are, something that is crucial to who we are, the way we move through the world, that people cannot tell by looking at us, and inviting those elements into the conversation. Then it makes it not a lesson plan about being transgender. It makes it a conversation about who we are on the inside and the assumptions people make about who we are based on our outside. Okay, so one more element to bring into this discussion, sexual orientation. Well, sexual orientation is simply who are you attracted to? What is your gender? What is their gender? And then we assign a label to it. What is very difficult for our society to recognize is that being transgender is not some type of sexual orientation. One's gender identity can exist and be named from very early age possible, like in that animated short, that parent's daughter, transgender daughter, was saying she was a girl as early as 3 years old, almost at the same time she's learning to speak. So she's articulating that very early, whereas her sexual orientation, we may not have any memo about that until the time of the kid starts expressing crushes or interests in other people. I feel like if we got to a place of recognizing that having a gender identity difference was not a sexual orientation issue or conversation, we would be well on our way to understanding how we can incorporate these conversations easily and readily with kids of any age. And that is the pathway for understanding that allows any of us as adults, and speaking about teachers, for example, when they think, I don't know how to talk to children about this topic. Yeah, I'm going to come out of this because we'll see whether I go back to the PowerPoint or not. So I just want to give a quick example. There's been a number of conversations with staff in schools, and I will have a teacher raise their hand and say, I'm a kindergarten teacher, and I have a kid like that in my class almost every year at school. And sometimes they get teased or bullied, and I don't know what to do because we're not supposed to talk about sexual orientation. So that's a powerful, powerful statement coming from a teacher with children as young as kindergarten. So what that teacher is observing is a difference in a child's, likely going to be a difference in a child's gender expression. So that might be the boy that likes to wear a skirt or loves to have a pink shirt and barrettes. It might be a kid with a short haircut that is the first to sign up on the kickball team, whatever. But they're seeing some difference that's related to gender expression. Teacher logs this and says, oh, where do I see that? Oh, I see that in the gay and lesbian community. Boom, all of a sudden a 5-year-old is either gay or lesbian. Also, like that animated short said, the mom is deciding that her 3-year-old is likely gay. The kid's just expressing their gender and also articulating their gender identity. What happens if the teacher is clocking that in that way and categorizing that means inaction when a situation of bullying shows up? And it might just be teasing, hopefully not too awful, but nevertheless, teasing progresses to bullying, progresses to unsafe environments. So if we're deciding this is an expression of sexual orientation, and we're waiting until that 7th grade, 8th grade, whatever age, where they start bringing in the health ed curriculum to talk about gender differences, we already have a very entrenched environment that kid has been living with that puts them in harm's way on a regular basis. It doesn't just get undone because, oh, we got a memo that says maybe there's some gender differences that can be discussed. And that's assuming that the health ed curriculum might even venture into that territory. I don't want a kindergarten teacher being immobilized and not able to act when harmful behavior is occurring or misbehavior. I need that person. The child needs that person, and all the other kids need that person to be able to act and interrupt bad behavior. So when we think about, actually, I will go back to this again. When we think about these 4 components, and we're trying to find out how do we talk to children about this, we can address anatomy by taking it off the table, and we could take the sexual orientation piece off the table and focus in on gender expression and gender identity, because those are things that those kids are engaging with right from the get-go. When discussions about bodies come into play at whatever age as part of the curriculum, address that then. Same with sexual orientation, address that then. Not saying that kids won't bring up body parts, but if, for example, yeah, let me think about this. Teachers already know how to address questions about private parts by feeding back to those children that they're called private parts for a reason, and that it isn't appropriate to inquire about the genitals of someone else. So even a teacher getting that memo is very, very helpful, because our adult minds, this is where we are as adults. We have grown up. We have been we have received the gender norms and the expectations. We have moved through physical changes with puberty. We have stepped into potentially like romantic relationships and dating as adults, and moving forward, right? And entering into intimate relationships with other people. So we bring all of this into the mix, and we forget that children are not. I'm trying to think of a good example. Gosh, yeah, even one pretty early on. A principal and I are talking about having discussions with kids, and she's asking like, well, what about surgery? What about genital surgery? And it took me a bit as people are asking this question off and on in the first couple of years of me doing this work, um, to realize like, actually, wait a minute. um, Kids don't ask those questions. Adults do. And we as adults are doing this for all the reasons I've mentioned, plus the understanding that being transgender is an adult experience. We are only seeing children these days getting that early support for their gender identity, and then we make assumptions, erroneous assumptions, that children are undergoing genital surgeries at 9 years old or younger. That's not happening. We're making assumptions about sexuality and conversations that might happen in the classroom, or we fear would happen in the classroom about sexual practices, because our brains, our adult brains, might be spinning on that a little bit. So I just wanted to mention that focusing on gender expression and gender identity are the two areas to step into. I'm going to pause for a second and take a swig of water and catch my breath and see if there's any comments or questions so far on any of that. And you're Kelsey, I'm not looking at the chat to know whether there's anything going on there yet.
You are good so far. I know, I mean, if everybody else is like me, I'm just trying to absorb and soak this all in a little bit, digest it, and yeah, really appreciate like book recommendation, and yeah, it's yeah, very interesting. So yeah, so I don't have any questions. I don't see any in the chat. That does not mean that anyone doesn't have them. So please put them in there if you would like Q&A or chat, everybody.
Yeah, please do so. And I'm just going to keep going. Lots to cover. And I want to emphasize too that we do have a second part. We'll cover a little bit of that next time, but really quickly, because there is a lot to talk about. So I want to share something else that I feel like is important, and things that I've learned along the way. I've yet to have a principal or a school superintendent come to me and say, Aidan, I'm terrified of this subject. I don't know what to do, and we could really use some help. Um, they might say part of that, but they don't say the terrified part. But what I have experienced is that there's a lot of fear that shows up. And at the top of the list is often not so much fear of how their colleagues are going to engage, but how the parent community is going to respond. I do feel like that has ramped up pretty significantly in recent years, where the pushback is significant. And if you've seen any of the stories out there or images that I've seen, you'll understand why that fear is there. If you see, I remember seeing a picture of people protesting at a school with signs that said, "Do not teach graphic sex education to our kindergartners." The reality is, in my work world, there's zero discussion of graphic sexual practices in kindergarten, first grade, second grade, etc. I'm not well versed in health education curriculum. I've got my own area of interest, and I love talking to kids about who they are on the inside, and who others see them on the outside, and watching those amazing conversations as they discuss this with each other. So I want to give a couple of examples there. Um, and this vast disparity between the experience of adults as we consider stepping into this versus the reality of what happens when the kids have these conversations. Many calls, many meetings, many emails set up because one second grader is interested in sharing with her classmates that she's a transgender girl. What it took to have that conversation in the classroom was pretty significant, and had to go all the way up to the superintendent of the entire district for approval. Um, I'm guiding as best as I can the school counselor who's going to lead this conversation, and telling her, this is what you do, this is how you do it. Bring in this element, bring in that element, and you'll have a great time. And she ends by saying, "But you're going to come do it, right?" And there had been no discussion of me leading this conversation. And I did shift gears and said, "If you really want me to, I will come in and do this." So I did use that book, read A Crayon Story. And the discussion was such where we could talk about, again, who we are on the inside. And we were able to set up this discussion in a way that the second grader was able to share who she was. And she said, "Well, when I was little, everyone thought I was a boy, but I wasn't. I was a girl." There was no upheaval. There was no shock. As a matter of fact, I remember this one other little kid kind of leaning up against the wall, looking bored out of his mind and saying, "Oh, that's called trans. That's called being trans." That was the only level of discussion that occurred around that. But where the kids really did liven up was being able to talk about um, those things that they experience. So one kid, he says, "Well, nobody can tell by looking at me that I am a 7-year-old uncle." And another kid said, "Well, all the people in my family have unibrow, so I'll probably have unibrow." The kids were pretty dang excited. They had to have a little instruction on what unibrow meant. The um, counselor stepped into the conversation, and she shared something that she said, "I haven't shared this with anybody at school before, but I have a pacemaker. It's this machine in my heart that helps it keep pumping." And the kids were very, very interested in that. And another teacher in the room who actually was a substitute teacher, and he said, "Well, nobody knows that this is not my real ear. When I was little, a dog bit me and I lost my ear. They had to make a new one for me." That was the show stealer in all of this discussion. And the kids wanted to know if it worked. And of course, he's teasing them. "What? What? I can't hear you." Uh, those are the beautiful, amazing conversations that can be had to incorporate a gender difference like the one kid did that required multiple meetings before the conversation could even happen. I mean, I think that kid wanted more attention given to her about this, but the kids were pretty matter of fact and about it. Um, So that's often my recommendation for how to lead those conversations. And that can include a kid who they might know to be one gender who shares with them something different. "Well, you all have thought that I was a boy, but I'm here to share with you that I'm a girl and that I want to change my name from Joey to Joanna." Um, if they've had that conversation, it's very easy and matter of fact. And the thing that they can do much faster than any adult is switch names and pronouns. They can do that pretty readily, and it's very intuitive and makes sense to them, while we as adults might struggle and really have to get in some serious practice. Um, Now, conversations with older kids can be interesting too. They're going to bring in more layers. But the things I've heard from older kids have to do with thinking about one child in sixth grade who's sharing with his classmates that he's transgender. They've known him his entire life, and they didn't know that about him. So he shared I helped set up the conversation with them, and then he was able to share his story. And the kids were so amazing. They said, "Gosh, that seems like that must have been really hard when um, when you couldn't change your passport, when your passport said one gender while you knew yourself to be a different gender." They weren't caught up in the, oh my gosh, you didn't tell us, or we didn't know, or we should have known, or whatever. They were empathetic and a thoughtful inquiry about how this young man moved through daily society and how that must have been for him. And I know there was one other conversation with a group of older students about maybe they were eighth grade or so, uh, where they were discussing the presence of a transgender student. Like they didn't have a specific example, they didn't have somebody in their class, but more conceptually. And like, yeah, I'm sure we'd be fine with having a transgender student. They're pretty matter of fact about it. Uh, but then we posed a question to them and said, well, what if that transgender student likes you? What if they show an interest? And, we saw some kids shifting around like, gosh, I don't know. And they're very aware of their peers. And everyone is waiting for someone to say something. And there's this kind of nice long pause. And finally, this young woman puts her hand in the air. She, shoots it up and she goes, well, what I want to know is, are they hot? Because if they're hot, that's all that matters. And that one student completely set the tone for how any of them might um, experience this moving forward, because she pretty much laid it out as to what really mattered. Do I like them back? And I thought that was pretty fantastic. And that's got to be, gosh, at least 18 years ago now, that conversation. Um, yeah. So tons of examples. One of the things that I like too about uh, how conversations can occur with children is that the things that these young people bring in are pretty significant. Uh, there's one, yeah, let's see, let me think about this. One classroom where there was a kid in there that was actually going to be going by a different name and pronoun. So that was the impetus for the conversation. And the introduction of that was, this student, Joey, you've all known since kindergarten. Joey's letting us know that in his heart and in his mind, he feels himself to be a girl. And because of that, wanting to change his name to Joanna. So what we're going to do is we're going to start referring to her as Joanna. We're probably going to make a mistake here and there. So let's make sure to remind each other of the new name, so that she gets consistent use with her as we move forward. And she was really afraid that you would tease her about this. And so the conversation, we shifted to a conversation about teasing. How many of you been teased about something? Raise your hand. All the kids raised their hand. We asked them to keep their hands in the air and look around the room. And I remember their faces to this day because of how shocked they were that every hand in the room was up. And there was one young person close to me who I saw her face get angry as she looked at another student. And I know that that is a person that gives her a hard time, but her eyes kept moving across the room. And then she had another look on her face that said, ooh, but that's the kid I tease. Those kids then, those who felt comfortable sharing, started sharing their experiences. Oh, well, kids tease me because I'm the tallest kid in the class and a girl. Kids tease me because my family eats different food than everyone else. Kids tease me because I didn't know English last year. My family moved from Korea. And so I didn't know the language yet. Kids tease me because my dad's in prison. Kids tease me because I have two fathers. There were so many different things that they brought into that room in a really short amount of time. And we're talking 25 minutes. And I watched kids get up after those 25 minutes and go up to each other and say, I'm so sorry. I'm one of those people that teased you and I will never do it again. Um, Incredible conversation and so easy and so valuable. Not just a lesson again on being transgender, but on having empathy for each other and being kind and respectful to each other, honoring our unique qualities, recognizing what we have in common. This same class was a class that a teacher beforehand had told me was a real problem set of students. And she said, good luck. We all have a difficult time with that particular group of students. To this day, that is the most beautiful group of students I've ever seen. And they showed me exactly what the problem was, at least from my, very limited vantage point, in that they'd been busy torturing each other for the ways in which they were different, trying to gain acceptance, trying to fit in, rather than honoring the incredible experiences that they all either embodied or had within their families or their interests or whatever. So pretty dang impressive. Let's see. I see a
Yeah,
question.
there's a question, and it's a perfect kind of tangent from what we were just talking about. Do you have advice for speaking with people about your child who knew them before they transitioned and are using their old pronouns and or names in a conversation, assuming that your child is not present?
So let's see. So speaking with people about your child. Okay, so the child is the transgender person and you're speaking to other people. Is that what I'm getting? The child is the transgender person, or are we talking about speaking with children about?
Yes.
Okay, that's correct. Okay. Um, you can do it any number of ways. Some people, and this is, this varies by human, right? What people are comfortable with doing, what they'd rather not discuss, who they're talking to. Is it just, the neighbor 2 blocks over? Is it your best friend? Um, is it your own parents? Is it your pastor at church? Any conversation might have a different set of variables. I can say that because I've had engagement now with thousands and thousands of parents along the way over a lot of years, that universally it's pretty exhausting to have conversations with everyone because it's not just kind of updating somebody about a name and pronoun difference. It is it is an effort to facilitate a shift in understanding that a person may or may not be ready for, that a person may or may not be open to hearing, or may tell you all sorts of things about what you could or should do, um, and viewing that um, request or honoring of a name and pronoun change as being coddling, indulgent, dangerous, harmful, any number of things that any of us may have preconceptions about. So it's a massive conversation that occurs over and over and over with these families on what to do, how to do, when to do. So I think you have to think about, am I running into somebody in the grocery store? And what do I feel like dealing with at that moment? I'm tired. I've just finished work. I still have to go home and make dinner. Um, you can say, God, that person may ask how your children are. How are your daughters? And you may say, gosh, I'd love to catch up. Um, let's make sure to get a cup of coffee soon because I do have some updates. That's one way to address it. That way you're not, addressing something like that in the produce aisle. There's strategies for having conversations. Um, I happen to know, as a trans person, that it just does not take long for my story to come out. And I always bring up examples of airplanes because, sometimes you're next to a chatty person. Oh, well, where are you going? Are you work or vacation or what? And oh, what kind of work do you do? Well, right there, I'm taking a deep breath. This could be a really long flight, or not. It could be very interesting. It could be very awkward. So I have learned how to share what I do in work. And I almost always will share it because that is part of my work. Um, every once in a while, I might just say, "Oh gosh, I don't know, whatever." Make up something that isn't is designed to discourage conversation. But I don't know. I view every engagement with a human as an opportunity for discussion. But I know that that person is likely going to have a reaction with capital letters. I don't know what that reaction is going to be, but I know it's coming and they don't know what's coming. So I want to be as gentle as possible as I do that. So sometimes I start sharing, well, actually, yeah, the work that I do is I run an organization that offers training in schools and support to parents who have transgender children. And as I'm talking, I'll keep talking, but I'll actually even turn my head the other way so that I'm giving them time to move through whatever reaction they might need to have while not being on the spot with me looking at them. And I may also share with them that, yeah, I mean, it's an incredible conversation that I love to have. Of course, people have a lot of questions that deserve answers, that deserve conversation, and that there's any number of perspectives on that. So if I'm setting it up in that way, I'm showing them that they can say what they want, and that we can have a conversation. Um, I happen to think that there are some ways that so let's say if you're a parent of a trans child and you've got somebody that's pretty pivotal. Maybe it's your own sibling, the child's aunt or uncle, and you're telling them for the first time, and you don't know how they're going to react. And even if you think they may show up and do something quite different. So knowing that people can have a very visceral reaction, um, you can again make room for that. But my first step is to validate. Um, so if they say, "Oh my gosh, what do you mean? I mean, that doesn't sound right. That could be a phase. Why would you even consider changing the name and pronoun for somebody so young?" You can step in rather than trying to defend your child and show them, like, trust me, I've thought about this. You can come in and say, yes, those are excellent questions. I ask myself those too. I've lost sleep about that. What if my child is going through a phase? They are so young. Wow, I don't even know where this is going to go. If you are validating their question, then you are setting that conversation up to continue rather than come potentially be combative. Now, that takes energy and that can be exhausting. So I do want to emphasize that again. Um, People sometimes need some time. I had a friend who did not react well at all when I shared with her what journey I was beginning, and she was not happy with me for a solid 2 years. And I would run into her in different social situations, and I just kept being consistent with her because I thought, you know what? I'm still the same person regardless of how I look. If that's really too much for her, she's going to have to decide that the friendship should end. And at the 2 year mark, approximately, I saw her one day and I went, okay, here we go again. I took a deep breath to prepare myself. And had done a 180. And she said, I owe you an apology. I've been spending a lot of time talking to a lot of different people and learning more. And what I've learned has shown me that if I keep trying to define the world in the way that I've thought it was, my world is going to keep getting smaller and smaller. And I don't want that. And she's been an amazing friend ever since. I almost gave up. 2 years is a pretty chunky time. So, what do you need to do if that's a person in your life? Do you have the 2 years to give them? Maybe you don't. That's okay. I always want to leave the door open a little crack in case somebody comes back around. But there's also taking care of oneself and one's family. How's that? Any more on that?
Yeah, there are a few thanks and acknowledgments that that's I think what they were looking for.
Okay.
You have another question. It asks, yeah, just saying thank you, perfect. What's the best way to respond when you mispronounce someone?
Like messing up a pronoun or something, I'm assuming.
Yes, I think so. I'm just waiting to see if there's a clarification, but no, I think that's what.
Probably.
Yeah,
That's a common
yeah.
common occurrence. Hmm. You're asking me, right? You're not asking the trans community in general. You're asking me. So here's what I have to say. We goof up. I goof up. I've worked with people that use they and them pronouns, and when I look at that person, they, them works. Like that comes together in my brain because of their presentation. But this other person, no. No, they look very feminine to me. And my brain starts to short out a little bit. And so, what do I do if I'm on a if I'm getting ready to go on a Zoom meeting um, with them and I'm afraid I'm gonna goof up? I make a sticky, they, them, and I put it on my computer. Whoop, right? So that I'm reminded. That's usually enough to help me get through the entire meeting with that my own little nudge, and that can improve over time. So I think giving some thoughtful attention at the outset. Oh, I'm going to see that person. I'm going to see my niece, nephew, nibbling, whatever term, and they're using whatever pronoun, go ahead and practice it a few times. You've known that person perhaps their entire life. It's not going to roll off the tongue easily just because your heart wants it to. Um, we're human. So, number one, forgive yourself for being human and making mistakes. Just correct yourself if you realize it. If they correct you, oh, I'm sorry, I meant, she or they or whatever the pronoun is. And going to be effective. So, I want to give one quick example. I did work with an organization where there was a transgender person there that worked there. She went back east to visit her father, who was dying. She knew she wasn't going to see him again. And she went back and visited him, and she came back to work, and somebody goofed up her pronoun, and she lost it. She was upset and angry. Went to a manager, said, "I can't, I don't need to tolerate this," etc. A pretty extreme reaction for somebody goofing up. But what everyone didn't know is that her father refused to even acknowledge her identity as a woman on his deathbed. She knew it was the last time she was going to see him. And that's pretty heartbreaking. So she gets back to work, and, some poor, unfortunate person slipped up. Um, Nothing to be done about that except to try to have some compassion in the moment. You may not know that that was the circumstances for that person, but you can know that an extreme reaction means somebody's got a lot going on. And I'll tell you, it is a lot to have to defend your desire to be referred to by a certain pronoun to everyone. And to hear the many, many reasons why they can't. Um, a slip is a slip, but sometimes people are saying, well, I'm older, or I whatever, or I've known you my entire life, and or what I mean, or whatever. It's you're one person, and you have that experience with them, but they have multiple people in their lives, and they're dealing with that on a constant basis, and that can be hugely taxing. So that is why if you can take some effort and practice, fantastic. It's developing a new muscle. It isn't easy, but it gets easier over time. And I can say that, and I can also say I still goof up on occasion. But every time I goof up, I correct myself. And I think the last time I did it, I used she when the pronoun was they and them. And I said, I'm sorry, I meant they. And I continued on. And that person said, thank you. And that was it. That's all that was needed in that moment. And I'm working in a gender organization, and this is my world 24/7. How's that for an answer?
I don't know if you saw the comment, but someone's going to share that clip with the grandparents.
Uh, uh,
Yeah,
oh,
that was great.
yeah,
Oh,
grandparents are often brought up. And sometimes parents will say, "Oh, my grandparent, or excuse me, my parent will never get this because of their age." You know what? You don't know. You can decide certain things, but you don't know for sure. And that parent of yours, the grandparent of a child, may have had a lot of life. Surely they had a lot of life before you showed up on the planet. And they may be able to roll a lot easier, but also figure out how to support that person in getting it right. And that could be telling them what that means to the kid, and what it means to them when they don't hear it. Because there's no way that a grandparent is wanting to invalidate, harm, hurt their grandchild by deliberately not doing this. At least I like to think so. But they don't necessarily know the impact that it has on that young person when they get it wrong. So yeah, grandparents can do it. Um, they might need uh, a little encouragement, some reminders. Uh, yeah, setting the expectation. This is here. This is a piece that, when it comes down to it, like, what do we care? Transgender people have been walking around on planet Earth for a long time. What's the big deal? Well, the big deal is that the population is now visible instead of invisible, largely speaking. And so what's also different is the efforts to be inclusive and acknowledge someone's gender identification and engage with them in the way that every person expects. So uh, I had a superintendent back east say, well, I can't make people use the right pronoun. And I'm still struggling. I didn't challenge that person on that then because I knew I was going to have a follow-up call. um, but but here's the thing: everyone expects people to use the right pronoun for them. If I started engaging with him and using she and her pronouns, he would not be happy. Uh, and if I just said, "Well, look, you can't expect me to do this," he might have some choice things to say to me. So I just want that recognition. And the recognition is that we don't typically switch pronouns for somebody. But we are in a moment in time where that is occurring. Nobody uses she and her pronouns for me anymore. It's been 26 plus years now. Um, so nobody's wringing their hands and saying, "Oh, I just can't do that, Aidan," because there's been a long enough time and enough changes have occurred. Should a person be required to go through physical changes enough that you then feel like, "Oh, I guess I could do it now because you look the part"? You know, that's that's chock full of judgment and expectation that um, I don't think is necessary. Can we learn to just be more adaptable with pronouns? Well, my neural pathways are pretty entrenched, so it's harder. Younger generations, watch them. They're doing better and better uh, like that. So we can learn from them, and we can stretch our brains and know that, maybe we're helping our brain health as we mature. There's a plus, getting the pronoun right. I know we're getting close to time here, so I want to take a second and um, there's some things that I feel like we can dig into next time. I want to make sure I talk about emphasize a little bit more this cultural shift, and especially just just using a generational component here, where this adults who have had a certain construction of gender for our entire lives versus younger generations that actually do incorporate this term gender identity, that do understand about it, that do understand about people with intersex differences, and that gender can be expansive. So those two distinct, I'm generalizing, but two distinct categories of humans. Um, we're essentially in a moment in time in the present where we've got the past clamoring quite loudly and resisting, and the future saying, "What's the problem?" So being able to look at that, I think would be a great conversation. I want to address some of the questions that do come up pretty often. They're so young. How can they know this about themselves? What if they change their mind? What if they are going through a phase? Sometimes questions come up about being influenced by peers, being influenced by social media. These are all really important questions to discuss and not to dismiss. So I do want to take time to do that. There's also some things that are elevated in terms of interest in conversation and volatility. The question of participation in sports, and especially transgender girls and young women participating in sports. Um, we're in Washington State. If you didn't know, Washington State has the nation's first gender inclusive policy for K through 12 students. It is not quite 20 years old, but a pretty solid chunk of time. So I do want to share a little bit about that. There's questions that come up about parents' rights versus student rights, the history of policy and guidelines in Washington State for school districts. I want to chat a little bit about that. Um, what else? What else? Things like that. Um, I hope that people are feel comfortable or confident enough, even if that's submitted anonymously, to ask the questions or put in thoughts that are really on your mind. I'd rather them be on the table for examination rather than worry about whether uh, the perceptions of others. I've yet to have a question that I didn't think was a legitimate question to explore. So I want to encourage that for our next time. Um, and then also a little bit of discussion about the differences that show up that inform people's perspectives. And let me think about this. The top pieces that come to mind are, and not necessarily in this order, it just depends. Faith, politics, and cultural differences tend to be factors that are brought into the mix by school administrators. So I want to share some examples of those kinds of things also. Let's see.
There's one last question here. Can you,
See that.
how is it for someone to change their gender expression in teenage years versus knowing or expressing their gender from a young age?
Yeah. I want that question for next time, and I also want to say a little bit about it now. I don't know. Anybody in this room change their gender expression from when they were teenager? I know I have, independent of being transgender. Um, so there's a there's a culturally accepted expectation and understanding that we will um, we will express our gender in certain ways along the way. We may always do it within the context of being a girl and a woman. We may always do it in the context of being a boy or a man. We may float around and poke and prod at some more fluid ways of doing that. I do believe that the gender expression of any human can be varied over time. And what do you wear when you go to a job interview versus what you might wear when you go for a night out of dancing? They can be quite different. But I think there's probably more in that. Well, I'm sure there's more in this question about somebody who's expressing their gender and or gender identity in ways that what happens as they move along. If they're doing this when they're young, what happens when they hit teenage years? What happens when they get past that? Is there movement there? And the short answer is absolutely. So I think that would be a really good thing to discuss, and including that study, the Trans Youth Project that we're over halfway through. What are the numbers? What does that look like? I think that is definitely something that would be great to talk about. Look at me kind of pausing and ending on time. That never happens.
That was, yeah, I mean, couldn't have planned that better.
Really.
Yeah, that was great. For those of you who are still with us, it would be, uh-oh, there we go. Internet's back. I'm having jumpy internet right now. Gotta love it. Okay, for those of you who are still with us, it would be wonderful if you could fill out a little survey for us. It is enormously helpful for us when we are trying to get more money to do more of these kind of events. And we also really like to inform our events like this from the community. Aidan is here because of feedback we received from the community last year. And so we are truly responsive. We have another event at the end of the year that's going to be totally dependent on what y'all are asking for. And so please give us feedback about what you want to hear, but also feedback about, oh, for Pete's sakes.
I know. I see you looking at that.
Of course there is. Why is it always, hold on, silly logistical things, right?
Well, while you mess with that, let me take a second and do a quick plug for my book, Trans
Please.
Children in Today's Schools. I'm going to put that in the chat also. I can't tell you how many stories I've had about kids, about their families, about situations that have occurred in schools, some expected and some wildly unexpected. And I packed them all into a book. And so I'd like to let folks know about that. And I love to give a discount if you're interested in getting a book for 30% off. Uh, it's published by Oxford University Press, which I was delighted that they said yes to my book. Um, and I'm not a fan of heavy academic writing or reading that myself. So it's very accessible language, and um, I don't think it's a dry reading at all. So just wanted to put that in there too.
So when we send out our follow-up email, the survey will be in there. Let's just go with that. Thank you for pointing that out, Jessica. Um, well, that's it for us tonight, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. Aidan, that was wonderful. Really informative. I'm really, really looking forward to the second follow-up and just diving in even deeper and just hearing more about this. Sometimes I need a minute to kind of let my brain catch up to, I'm really looking forward to the next one. And everyone, thank you for joining. Thank you for being here. This is why we do it. So yeah, we hope to see you all February 10th. Same time, it's the same link. We will, of course, send it out to you in the days before. But if you have the link, that's the one we'll use next time. We're also going to make sure that we post this recording. So feel free to share with community members. We'll be sending that out as well in the next couple days. But yeah, that's it, everyone. I'm going to stop the recording now.